lecture that we will have today. But before, I would like to present, of course, the person who will give us his insights and share with us his experience and expertise, Mr. Leon Isaacs. So I will present him. Mr. Leon Isaacs is founder and chief executive officer of DMA Global, which is a company focusing on international development, and was founded in 2007. He's an expert and business leader. His expertise is in payments and international development, certainly more in migrant remittances, diaspora investment, and diaspora engagement, and financial inclusion. So he has a lot of experience, and this is also the experience that he will share with us today in his presentation about, of course, remittances, diaspora investment, and diaspora philanthropy. So I will let him talk and present his expertise. Before that, I would like to say again, for people interested, for people that want to engage, please send your questions in the chat. And then when the question and answer will start, I will immediately ask them to Leon. And for the people that want to ask the question directly, just put your camera on and then you can speak, and you're free to go. So that's it. And Leon, it's your turn. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much indeed for that very kind introduction, Gregory. Good afternoon to all of you from a very wet and quite dismal Paris today. Not normally like that here, but today it is. It's my great pleasure to be talking to you today. It's a little bit daunting for me because I feel the brain power of each one of you is far greater than mine, but I've been asked to talk about the topic of diaspora economic contributions, and I'm delighted to do that with you and share some thoughts and comments. And as Gregory said, if anything's not clear, please use the chat. And if you've got any thoughts or ideas, or you don't agree with what I'm saying, then please raise that as well, and look forward to discussing that in the Q&A. So I'm just going to try and share my screen with you all, which doesn't look like it wants to do that yet. Sorry, bear with me one moment. I don't know if you need to do anything, Gregory, to enable me to share what I have here.
I think normally you have the opportunity to share. You have the possibility to share your screen.
Yeah, let's have a look. Yeah, you might. Sorry, not technical wizard, but normally this works fine.
You are co-host. You have to just click on share screen. The bottom, you can see green color share screen.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing, but it's not giving me the option.
Have you opened the document in the background?
Yeah. Sorry, not technical wizard, but normally this.
You can click share screen, then you can see all the windows on the screen. You select the window and click on share.
Yeah, that's what normally happens. But when I just click share screen,
yes,
it doesn't come up with any of those. It's just coming up with, oh, hang on, maybe let's try this one. My apologies.
Have you opened the document in the background, the file?
Yeah.
Can you see the share screen tab, that option?
Yes, yes, which is a sort of greeny color.
Yes. Yes.
Otherwise, if it doesn't work, I can share it from my computer. Then you have just to tell me when I have to treat the two sheets.
Right. It's telling me I have to leave the meeting, so perhaps it would be easier if you. Hang on.
I think I left the meeting.
I think he will log in again, and then it will work.
Joined again, I think I can see his name. Yes.
Perfect. Perfect.
Done. Okay.
Leon, you're muted. I don't know if you're speaking, but you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Right, sorry, let's go for this again then, and I'll try and make up for the lost time. Apologies for that. So the topic is diaspora economic contributions. And I think when we normally look at this, most people who are working in the area of international development and migration and so on tend to think of remittances, and they'd be right. So I'm going to talk a fair amount about remittances and cover most of the major areas there and the key considerations for individuals and governments. But another key area, there are lots of areas where diasporas actually do contribute, but the other bucket that I want to focus on is what we would call diaspora investment. So this is different to remittances, which are payments. This is a much broader set of activities and is something that's become far more popular and attracted a lot more attention in the last few months. And it includes things where individuals are actually generally making a financial decision, normally financial decision, to support their country of origin in order to get a return themselves. And this can either be through government funded or managed activities, or actually those that are managed privately. But there are other areas as well, including things like diaspora philanthropy, which is becoming more and more popular, and then diaspora trade, nostalgic trade, and more traditional trade, and also the important area of knowledge transfer. So there is quite a lot to cover here, and I apologize if I rush through some of this, so please do stop me. And Gregory, I'd ask you to interrupt me as I don't have the chat feature shown while I've got the screen sharing here. So let's make a start on remittances. And just to say, from a personal viewpoint, I started working in the remittances area back before, I'm sure many of you were born, but in 1993, at a time when I was working for a travel and financial services company called Thomas Cook. which was quite famous at the time, they had a paper-based product called a traveler's check, and they were worried that was going to be replaced by new technology, things like in those days prepaid cards. But one of the others was international payments and transfers. And so I got involved then. And just to say that at that time, the remittances market looked very different to how it does now. I'll share more of that with you later. But I think one of the things over this century anyway is that the awareness of the importance of remittances has grown, and the contribution that remittances can make to the GDP of some countries has become much better understood, although there's still a lot of challenges around that as well in terms of how that's interpreted. Remittance flows are now very large. We'll look at the size shortly, but they're actually larger than foreign direct investment and overseas development assistance for pretty much all developing countries apart from China. And in many ways, they are a real lifeline or support activity to the people who send remittances, and just as importantly, the people who receive them, which are normally from the same family. So this is a family support area in most cases. However, as the numbers have grown and organizations and countries have become more aware of them, there's more of a demand to see how they could be leveraged for the greater good. I think as this has happened, the role of diasporas has become a bit better understood, but also diasporas themselves have become a mixed phenomenon for different countries. Some are very in favor of them and others less so. Often it's driven, or nearly always, by politics. So I think let's get into starting with remittances themselves. So this first chart is really showing the size of remittance flows, but I think let's go with a definition, which is really that remittances are low value, person to person, regular transactions. We're talking about, I think many of you will be aware, these are transactions of maybe up to $1,000 a time, but more likely they're in the $200. That's what the World Bank would use as a global average, or most frequent amount that's sent, about $200 a time, which are sent quite regularly. And by that we mean probably between once a month and once every 2 months every year. One of the key things you can see here is on the left-hand chart is the size of the flows. So these are World Bank data, and I would say at the beginning that actually all the data I quote is going to be from official sources, but the official sources are all estimates, and there are lots of caveats about the quality of data in this space. So please always bear that in mind. If we took the chart on the left all the way back to 2000, the number would have been about $100 billion being sent worldwide as remittances to all countries, not just lower and middle income countries. But in the last year, the estimate is that this number was closer to $600 billion just going to the LMICs. So, and what's important is it's grown with the exception of 2020, when obviously we had the outbreak of COVID, and we'll talk about how that's impacted the remittance market in a little bit. But you can see that remittances have grown and can continue to grow. In terms of where do they go, I think the right-hand chart clearly shows you that in many ways, the largest countries, India and China, are the two largest most populated countries in the world. So that may not be a surprise, but you've got countries like Mexico, which is receiving the same amount as China or did last year. And then countries like Philippines, Egypt, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on in the top 10. So these are all markets that are receiving large volumes of remittances. And actually, obviously, these are important to each and every one of those countries. I mentioned about COVID, and I think it's important to put that into context there. We'll come back to the bigger picture, but as I know this is a hot topic and somebody might ask a question on it, in any case, I think it's important to understand that during the COVID crisis, remittances have been particularly stable and reliable. Given their role of supporting individual families, some of the poorer families in the world in particular, there was a real concern that when COVID struck, and obviously there were all the travel bans and lockdowns, and given that most of the money being received, or a lot of the money being received in the LMICs is coming from more developed countries, that there would be a massive fall in remittances. Indeed, the World Bank predicted soon after the major lockdown, so in around April and May of 2020, that there would be a 20% fall in remittances. They actually reduced this later in the year as the numbers held up pretty well and defied expectations. And the result was actually just a minor loss of only 1.7%, which is actually a pretty phenomenal achievement by all the people who send and receive money. But actually what was interesting was that by last year, 2021, it's estimated that there was a growth of 7.3%, and there's a further growth projected for this year. So it looks like, despite all of the challenges, that remittances have held up pretty well. Of course, this varied by region, and you can see sub-Saharan Africa, which unfortunately suffers from some quite poor data levels on remittances, actually saw a drop of 14%. So pretty significant, but even that's recovered quite well. So generally speaking, whilst 2020 saw a decline in actually only 2 regions, there was still growth then, or a steady state. But actually last year we saw growth in every single region, and that's projected to continue. So why is that? So I've listed the reasons, some of the reasons here. I think one of the first things to say is that when the way that remittances have traditionally worked, and I'm talking about both formal and informal remittances, and I'll talk a bit more about that later as well, but the way remittances have traditionally worked is that as a customer, I would walk with my cash into an agent of an international money transfer company, hand over that cash. So if I'm here in France, I'll go into a Western Union, hand over my cash, and then I'll ask for that money to be sent to, let's say, South Africa. The message will go via digital means between Western Union France and whoever is paying out in South Africa, and the receiver will walk in and physically collect cash at a location in South Africa. So when lockdowns occurred and people weren't able to leave home to send money, that was a big challenge. And what we saw was actually a big push to use more digital means than had been used before. At the time, pre-COVID, it was estimated that around about 85% of all remittances were cash-based. Now, and as a result of COVID, the digitization has improved a lot, or increased a lot, but now it's still estimated that about 70% of transactions involve cash somewhere in the line. So the other point, and the second bullet point here, is talking about informal remittances. So the number that I gave you, the $589 billion that was sent last year, sorry, the year before last, was actually the official number. That is using operators that have a license. They're approved to be able to do business. But what we also see with remittances is that it's estimated that there's an amount, probably between a third and a half of the formal values that are sent informally. So informally can mean basic things like somebody returning home with cash in their pockets that they've earned and using that for their own purposes in their country of origin. But it can also involve using services like Hawala and other operators that are not licensed, but do pretty much the same thing, and in some cases do it much better than the formal operators. However, because a lot of those informal operators rely on actually flying or moving around the world, physically carrying large amounts of cash to settle the transactions, one of the effects of the lockdowns and the travel bans was that they could not actually move the money. Many of them cannot continue to operate in anywhere like the same way they were before. And it's generally believed that quite a lot of transactions actually move from the informal services to the formal. Interestingly, what we're seeing now in places like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and so on is that as travel opens up and the market improves, there does seem to be a drift back to informal operators being much more successful than they were during COVID. The third influence that was very positive during the COVID time was the social protection funding and furlough type schemes that were made available to many migrants in the key sending markets. And as we know, many countries are dependent on migrant labour to fulfill a lot of the essential jobs, particularly in the health area. And so many migrants and remittance senders were able to continue earning and were therefore able to send money home. So there's a more robust response then. And then I think the final point, which may be perhaps the most important one, is for everyone to understand that these people are sending money home are doing so to another family member, and are doing so because in 90% of the time, the reason why they've moved from one country to another is to be able to support their family at home. So the pressure on them is enormous. And I think it's fair to say that most of them really stood up to the task and often had to make sacrifices themselves or draw on savings that were made specifically for this purpose. So all in all, COVID's impacted everyone all around the world, but the actual volume of remittances has stayed remarkably strong. So having just talked about the current, let's go to the economic importance of remittances. I've already said how large the flows were last year, but now I've got a question for you. So if you can all enter these in the chat, we won't hold it against you if it's not the correct answer. But the question is, excluding flows to China, remittance flows to LMICs in 2021 were higher than which of the following flows? So you've got 4 answers, as you can see: A, overseas development assistance; B, foreign direct investment; C, portfolio flows; or D, all. And if you could just submit your answers to the chat function, Gregory can tell me later how you've all got on. So I'll give you 2 seconds and let's go to the answer. And the answer, you won't be surprised to know, is all of them, particularly in last year. And I think, you know, when you look at this now and you can see that remittances, which have consistently grown over the last 30 years and at an increased rate in recent years, have been a far more reliable source of funding for most countries that receive remittances than foreign direct investment, which of course is very much driven by the economic conditions in the world really, but particularly in the key markets that send remittances. The portfolio flows, which as you can see is really unpredictable and performs differently to FDI, but in some ways driven by some of the same factors. And then you've got overseas development assistance or international aid, which has been reasonably consistent, but you can see in the last 25 years ago, remittances and ODA were about the same. Now remittances are somewhere between 3 to 4 times the size of ODA. So they're a really important source of funds into many of the poorest countries in the world. So another question for you to think about here is, and this is not a geography quiz, is for you to think about which countries are ranked highest in terms of remittances as a proportion of GDP for 2021. So this is not saying which countries receive the absolute most volume of remittances, but which countries have remittances as a significant portion of their GDP. So let me go to some of the answers. So the largest one, although actually recent data, I told you that data was not always easy in the space, but the most recent one that came out showed that Tonga is the highest at 44%. And I think, you know, that's really interesting because this is last year's figures prior to the terrible tsunami and volcanic eruption that they received. But I think what it does show is that for Tonga, they have definite migrant worker programs, particularly focused on New Zealand, Australia, and the USA. And that 44% of the GDP of Tonga actually comes in the form of remittances. Interestingly, a country like Gambia in West Africa, that is now over 50% based on most recent government figures, yet to be fully verified, but phenomenal numbers. Then we have Lebanon at 35%, Kyrgyz Republic at 30%, Tajikistan 28%, Honduras 27%. All of these countries and a lot more are dependent on remittances to keep the funds flowing in their country. And of course, the people receiving the money are then generally using it for consumption in those communities. That means that with the multiplier effects, you're finding that for these countries, they need to have and understand policies around remittances. The other thing you probably notice is that some of these countries are either quite small or fragile. And so that's one of the other key things, is that in times of crisis, remittances are quite often the first financial flow or the most important financial flow. In terms of natural disasters, they're often the first solution that is available to people when lines are cut and so on, or when they're restored, much faster than traditional banking options. But also for many, because they're supporting individual families and money's getting directly to them, it means there aren't delays with governments sometimes taking approaches that may not be particularly beneficial. So remittances are important to many countries. There are lots of challenges with remittances, and one of them is around the cost of remittances. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that there is a sustainable development goal for remittances, goal 10C, which basically says that by 2030, the average cost of a remittance should not cost more than 3%, and in no single corridor. So from country A to country B, would it be more than 5%? This actually was developed in 2015, so it has a 15-year time horizon. To put this into perspective, between 2009 and 2015, remittances fell in cost from something like around 10% to 7.5%. So you can see that to hit the 2030 goal, it's not as ambitious as it might be, but as we sit here today, we're looking at a cost of 6.3%. So it's more than double the target that we need to hit by the end of this decade. And also, to put that into context, that means that at the current moment of time, it is costing migrants around $37 billion to transfer their money home. If we got it down to 3% on current volumes, then obviously you're looking at just under 20 billion. And the sad thing is that it should be possible, with the way technology and improvements are, that actually the number should be much lower. And in fact, my personal belief is that we should be looking at a pretty much close to zero total cost for remittances by the end of this decade. But it's slow progress. And you probably won't be surprised to see that it does vary a lot by region. So South Asia is the lowest area, 4.3%, that has some of the largest flows, whereas Sub-Saharan Africa, which has smaller flows and a lot of fragmented markets, is the most expensive region. So, you know, it's a bit of a, what would I say? It's quite a mixed picture, but generally it's expensive. And you can see out of around about 120 corridors, 365 corridors, as measured by the World Bank. They have a site you can see at the bottom, remittance prices worldwide. There's 365 corridors on there. The US to Nigeria was one of the lowest at 2.87%. But then you look at Tanzania to Uganda, two countries that share a common border, and the cost there, 23.5%. So some of the costs are just prohibitive. So why is that? Well, I think a number of reasons. One is that the more digital a corridor, the cheaper it should be, which means that Tanzania to Uganda channel is particularly odd, given that there are digital solutions there. But certainly, one of the things is in the value chain that we see for remittances is that if you can introduce digital solutions, you immediately remove the need to have agents at both ends. So if you can send from your mobile to somebody else's mobile, and they can then spend the money in the local markets without the need to cash out, then you end up saying, sorry, Gregory, did you have a question? No? Okay.
That wasn't me.
No, okay, sorry. I'll carry on. So it really means that digitally is a much cheaper service, because you can save at least 50% by removing agents. And then there are other means to do so as well. The other reason why we've got high prices is in many corridors, there just aren't enough players. You'll see from the next point, regulation is particularly important for remittances, but some countries have some pretty unfriendly remittance regulations. Often they're restricting the service being provided to banks, and not all banks are particularly interested in providing services for these customers. Some are very focused, but not all. So we're really seeing that the more operators you've got, generally, as in most markets for most goods, it should be cheaper. What we're also seeing now, which is an encouraging side, is aggregators. So these are companies where if I set up a money transfer company here in France and I want to send to all of West Africa, instead of making individual agreements with payout partners in each country in West Africa, I can just work with one aggregator and he can turn on all the markets I want, which speeds up, increases speed to market, but also makes it a lot cheaper. Regulation I've talked about, but it's a real problem in some of the newest companies, well-founded, very secure, are not able to operate because they're not a bank. And then we have basic problems like infrastructure, particularly in rural areas. If people don't have access to power and don't have phone coverage and so on, which I know is reducing, but it's still there, that's a real problem and increases the price. So it's not just me talking about this, it's actually far more serious and weighty people. And what we've had really is the world waking up to the potential for remittances, but also some of the challenges. And so the global remittances agenda, not only do we have the Sustainable Development Goal, it's also in the Global Compact for safe, orderly and regular migration. And that goes further than just saying we want it cheap. They've also said there's a demand or an objective to promote faster and safer transactions as well as cheaper. And importantly, I think here, to ensure that financial inclusion for migrants is very much on the agenda, so that remittances can be used to promote financial inclusion. So I've talked about costs already. Digitization I've talked a little bit about, but it really does not only offer the opportunity to reduce costs, but importantly, if people can use digital solutions to receive their money that are remittances, why can't they use those same solutions for their other financial service needs? And that's the whole point of remittances. At the end of the day, a remittance is a transfer or movement of funds from one person to another. The key, the ongoing key, is what the people receiving the money are actually able to do with those funds. And so the ability to open accounts and undertake other transactions is really important. And for that reason, remittances are really seen as a gateway into financial inclusion. And, you know, we're starting to see, albeit embryonic, sorry, I can't get the word out, embryonically, the development of products that are linked to remittances. So, for instance, insurance-based products and so on. So, I'm just going to get you to think now a little bit about the potential benefits for remittances, or perhaps just channel your thoughts there while I share some of my thoughts around this. I'll be very interested later to know whether you agree with these or not. But some of the benefits of remittances, one of the leading authorities, a guy called Dirk Brater, who you may well have come across if you research this area, works at the World Bank in the Nomad facility. He describes remittances as dollars wrapped with care. And I think that is one of the key points, is these are very personal transfers, and we should never underestimate that. They're often a lifeline for families, but also they're a link between the sender and the receiver in the same family. We talked about one of the SDGs they link to, but there's a lot more. They can help with ending poverty, with helping to promote zero hunger, really helping. One of the big uses of remittances now is to support education, so they can really help there. What they do is they really help the around 800 million people that receive remittances, or in family, or are in family units that receive remittances. And there are studies, which I won't go into now, but happy to later, showing actually how remittance flows can have a really positive impact on poverty alleviation. A large proportion, round about half of the remittances, are sent to rural areas. Many of those are some of the poorer areas, so they really have a good contribution there. Sustainability, I think you've seen from the charts earlier that is clearly there compared to other methods of funding. And then there's also, they can really work in counter-cyclical times, or a method, and that seems to be particularly important, and one that dominates people's thinking, particularly on how can we make them even more robust, but they have that characteristic anyway. And there also are, whilst the majority of the money received is spent on consumption, around 75%, that means around a quarter is actually saved or invested by the recipients. And that's a particularly important feature going forward. They also help, the more the remittances, the more help that is to boost the exchange earnings or exchange rates in receiving countries. And they can have a positive effect on the national balance of payments, depending on what method is used to send them in. So that was some of the things for the positive. However, we have to be balanced here. And there are a number of potential disadvantages as well. So you could think about some of those, and please share those with us. Some of the negative impacts that have been studied is that there can be a culture of dependency on communities that receive remittances in the received countries. There are definitely studies that have shown there are certain towns or regions in a number of countries where basically the job prospects or the employment that's undertaken by many locals is diminished if they receive a lot of remittances. I have to say, from what we see, there is definitely examples of this, but it's few and far between and tends to be particularly specialized in certain areas, but undoubtedly that can have an impact. The other thing is there's an argument that says, well, people receiving remittances are spending them on food, clothes, and other daily necessities, and somehow this is a bad thing. Again, personally, I don't see that as a bad thing. I think it's normally said because people would rather they were used for longer term savings, investments, and to build up a store of wealth and improve the livelihoods of the receivers. And of course, we would all love that to happen over the long term, but we shouldn't ignore the fact that consumption means that people are spending money in the local communities, which is therefore giving more funds to that community and helping with their wealth. Then I think they're also saying that some countries tend to look at the flow of remittances and basically say that these people have found solutions to look after themselves, and therefore as a result of that there's less imperative for governments to help where they're needed, which I think is a developmental discussion that holds some water in a number of countries. Then there's some more technical areas. There's something called the Dutch disease phenomenon, which is basically that if there's a lot of remittances coming into a country, that supports or makes the local currency stronger. And in doing that, that would then have a negative impact on the exporter's potential to earn money because it will be more expensive for their clients to buy the currency. Overall, there may have been a few instances of that, but actually, I think the jury is generally saying that's probably a more theoretical example than something we see in practice going forward. So I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to try and just complete the remittances section with this side and the next one. So some of the key challenges we see in the remittance sphere are, one is a lack of robust and reliable remittance data. I mentioned that at the beginning. There's very little official data. It is getting better. Some countries like Pakistan, Philippines, Kenya and others are really good at publishing data, but most have nothing. And particularly the sending countries have very poor or no data on remittances, which is quite disturbing, really. I think the other thing I've talked about is the consumption side, so I won't talk about that. The dominance of cash is a problem because it gets in the way of introducing new, more efficient solutions, and it's expensive. Informal remittances they're a mixed blessing. The good thing about informal is they generally get the money to where people want it to go very quickly. And often at lower cost, but not always, and with minimum of ID requirements. The problems are the countries themselves don't see those flow of funds through their balance of payments. Also, there's no traceability. This is what gives remittances a bad name, in that if they're often being accused, and in the past have been accused of being used for funding terrorist operations, money laundering, and so on. And we're sure there is some part of that that takes place, but it's going to be less than 0.1 of 1%. It's very minor, but it still needs to be rooted out. But the risk is exaggerated compared to lots of the other big money laundering that we see around the world. Costs we've talked about. One of the things we see is that because financial inclusion rates vary depending on gender and so on, but those differences get evened out or made more level as a result of digitization. What we need to do at the moment is encourage digitization to help rural populations, and particularly women, to be more financially integrated. One of the other challenges is different countries have different regulatory environments, which just adds to the legal costs for businesses operating in this space. If they need to have 200 licenses as opposed to 50, it's a lot more expensive and a lot more money tied up. And then there's other things, and one we've recently seen is there's an increased interest around the world from a few governments in taxing remittances. Sometimes it's digital payments, like in Ghana's situation, but in others, like some of the Gulf states, they're continually trying to tax remitters or receivers. And the problem is that will just drive transactions underground. The money will move, but it won't move through official channels, so it will look even worse than it does now. So looking at potential solutions for remittances, one would be obviously to improve digitization. Second one is really to enhance financial education and digital literacy. One of the things we see, one of the reasons why people don't use digital solutions is because either they don't have the appropriate account or products available, or because they don't understand how to use them. So more work in that area would really help. Better data. Hopefully I've made it sound like there is some data out there. There is, but there's a lot that doesn't exist. I think there needs to be much more work on remittance-linked products, and we've started, to see a number of those coming forward, but there needs to be a lot more, and then harmonized regulation. So the future for remittances, I would say, really looks a bit like the following. First thing is really improving that link between remittances and development. And I think that's, particularly important based on what we've shown so far, to move from a payments basis to a development basis. The products that we need are not complicated products in themselves, but making a link to remittances has proved difficult so far. But we're talking about, basic financial propositions. Anybody who's really interested in this, I'd encourage you to find out more about Pakistan Remittances Initiative. It's been going now, it's in its 13th year. This is a comprehensive approach from the heart of government in Pakistan to really drive remittances from the informal to the formal, and then to actually use that as a basis for improving financial inclusion and improving the flow of funds through the communities. And the results have been phenomenal, and now they've moved from it being a remittance flow to basically an account-based product where you can organize mortgages, investments, all savings, all sorts of financial products there, and they've done a great job. There's a project that IFAD are running at the moment with funding from the EU called the Prime Africa Project, which is really trying to look practically at how you improve the environment in individual corridors, and to be very scientific and tactical about that. But those are a few of not very many examples. And then the other part would be digitization. For me, digitalization is actually the one area, if you could only do one thing, that would make a phenomenal difference, is to digitalize everything to do with remittances. It reduces costs, brings much more convenience, and unlocks financial inclusion. You probably will notice I haven't talked about cryptocurrency, blockchain, or some of the other areas that are really now becoming mainstream in the financial world for everyone. That's partially just because of time. I'm very happy to take questions on that later. But I think there's going to be solutions involving whether it's stable coins, central bank digital currencies, or potentially cryptocurrencies, but maybe not in the way that most people think. So I'll leave that thought with you if that's okay. And again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to go and talk now about Diaspora Investment, because I think I've got about 10 minutes left on this, so my apologies. So Diaspora Investment is really the area where, you know, individuals, it's different to remittances. This is money that individual migrants or diaspora members have in their host country, and look into how can that be attracted to their country of origin. And there are a number of different areas to it, and I'm just going to skate through these now. So I think this is different to, in many ways, to remittances, not just in what they are, but also in the fact that governments can be much more heavily involved here. And indeed, many governments have become aware of and identified that there could be, 10 years ago, the World Bank estimated that migrants in the LMICs probably had about $500 billion in savings in their host countries. Savings that in the current economic environment are not earning a great deal of return in all reality, and they could probably potentially earn a greater amount if it was invested elsewhere, i.e. their country of origin. Also, the diaspora is much more aligned with their country of origin than a normal investor might be, so they should be inclined to invest there. There used to be a theory that they would be prepared to take a lower return than a traditional investor who's not from that country. I think there is some evidence of this, but it's not as strong an argument as there used to be. But, and so many countries have started looking at this, but in quite a fragmented way. They've just seen a total and said, there's an opportunity. How do we get some of that? How do we attract some of that in? And that's been good that they're more aware of the value that their diaspora can play, but bad because the solutions that have been offered are generally those that the government wants. They're not driven by the consumer, or in this case, the diaspora member. And so I think there's a lot of need for more structure around the approach, which is good because I'm going to talk to you about something that was developed. We had a hand in developed for the African Development Bank, which was all about building a model that would allow individual countries to understand which elements of the diaspora investment market or tools they had available, what their current situation was, what their diaspora was and wanted, and then build solutions that are right for them, rather than trying to always introduce something like a diaspora bond, which is only really applicable in certain markets and normally only to the really large diaspora bases, the countries with large diasporas around the world. So the toolkit that was built has 4 pillars, which you can see here. Diaspora engagement being one, really understanding who and where your diaspora is. Secondly, a financial profile, which is actually all about what are the different elements of the financial marketplace that exist in a country, and what are the barriers and how can they be overcome. And then a diaspora profile, so different to the engagement piece. This is very much understanding enough about the diaspora, both in terms of where they are, what they earn, how much they have in savings, Are they first, second, third, fourth generations? What are their interests? What are their concerns about the country, etc., etc. And then the final pillar is donor support, because in most cases these things will only happen if donors actually provide some form of support. So understanding what the map of what that looks like is really important. And then armed with this data and answering these questions I've just put on the screen now, countries can then take decisions on how to approach diaspora investment. But I think, you know, the really important point around this is to make sure that governments really understand their diaspora, they listen to and are engaged with their diaspora, and then they design solutions that work for their diaspora. They obviously have to work for the government, but there's plenty of options there. But they need to listen to and be engaged with the diaspora, and that's often where this falls down. So that's that side. One of the other areas that we've been looking at is that in order to get governments to focus on their diaspora, it's really important to understand what are the diasporans contributing. And normally most countries at best will measure how large the remittance flow is and use that as a basis. But actually there's a lot more to it than that. And that's these areas we're talking about now around investing and philanthropy and trade and so on. So they need to develop solutions on that. And the IOM has come up with a product called Contributions and Counting, which is starting to be rolled out to do that, but it's very, very embryonic at the moment. Just to cover a couple of different mechanisms, because I think this often gets talked about, but it's not always clear what the difference is. For diaspora investment, there's really two types, direct investment or portfolio investment. So direct investment, which is normally driven by investment promotion agencies in the country that wants to raise money, is not, and they offer incentives and so on, is normally for specific projects or development. So potentially businesses to be based in a tax-free zone, producing goods that the country needs. And often the investment opportunities targeted at diasporans in the first place because they're more likely to receive these ideas positively. And then you've got portfolio investment, which I think most of you will be familiar with, but this is much more likely to be publicly quoted companies or bonds where investment is possible in a local stock exchange. Or mutual funds, those types of things where lots of people take a small amount. Just to give you a couple of examples of two sort of co-funded or matched funded initiatives in diaspora investment. One is called Vidu.Africa. This is run by the German development agency GIZ, basically available in, I think, Cameroon, Ghana and Ethiopia. And it enables relatively low levels of investment between 500 and 5,000 euros to be made by diasporans. And I won't go into all the details, but basically for every euro that the diasporan and their receiver put in, GIZ will match it up to a certain level. And that's been quite successful on a pilot basis in a short period of time. And then there's one that is in nearly every textbook on remittances or remittance-linked savings. And this is the 3-for-1 product that was developed in Mexico, actually over 20 years ago now. And this was basically taking the phenomenon of hometown association. So groups of Mexicans, particularly in California, but in America, who as a community raised money to develop things like schools, community locations, street lighting and so on in their particular town or area that they came from in Mexico. And for every dollar that they raised on that sort of fund to be sent, there was a dollar was put in by the Mexican government and $1 by the state in Mexico that they're in. And in fact, in some schemes, that was then matched by a money transfer company who would put in another $1. So that was a pretty successful initiative, but actually takes a lot of administration. So just briefly looking at some of the challenges with diaspora investment. One, I think we all can relate to, is a lack of trust. Often the diasporans just do not trust the government of their home country, or that there are enough safeguards in place. So it's a big problem to be overcome. Second one is often they don't like the fight, or in fact, their home country is not particularly strong financially, which is clearly a concern if you're investing money. Often they don't know much about it, or it appears to them that the government has said to them, we'd like your money, but it's not offering anything in return. So, you know, that's a particularly important challenge. And the other point is really often governments would like to be able to do something, but they really don't know where to start at the current time. So I'm just going to look at and say, well, what does the future look like? I think we are going to see more work in this area, and this is an exciting area for growth, actually. And many governments either have or are setting up specific units to work with their diasporans to improve communication, to develop products and help their economies. Many are now looking to understand their diasporans better to a degree. There's a lot more work needs to be done there. New products are coming out. I think part of the challenge is often that when a country looks to raise money, it goes to the international bond markets or the normal corporate international investors and does not include the diaspora. But there are now more products that are coming into this area. For instance, we know Indonesia is looking at developing some specific diaspora bond type products for their customers, and Philippines and others have done it more recently. And I think what we're seeing is this is a new area. So people are starting to ask more and learn more. And I think we'll see much more growth going forward. So apologies for the rush here. Philanthropy is another area, and I think it's one that we shouldn't underestimate. I know it's a growing trend globally, but what we see in this space is that, in fact, you don't have to have many, few very wealthy individuals can make a massive difference to their country of origin. And one example would be the Sahamiya Foundation, which is actually founded by a guy I know very well, Ismail Ahmed, who founded World Remit, which I'm sure some of you have used. He's from Somaliland, and he's put a lot of his wealth and pledged it, and also used his convening ability to assemble funds to really help around $500 million over the next 10 years. And to put that into context, Somalia receives around, it's estimated, somewhere between $1.5 and $2 billion a year in remittances. So it's a big chunk of money, and he's making a really big difference. And for some countries, that level of support is actually probably much more effective than some of the much more complicated initiatives that take place. Just moving finally to diaspora trade and knowledge transfer. So another area that diasporans can help economically their country of origin is with trade. Some of the obvious things are there's been this thing called nostalgic trade, where goods that are particularly relevant or popular in the country of origin are shipped and made available to diasporans. So this can be foodstuffs, clothing, all sorts of things that are specific to a country, and that adds value to the country of origin, of course. There are also areas where business owners who are in the diaspora from a particular country can play a valuable role in exporting to their country of origin goods that perhaps they can't find easily. But then you've also got the phenomenon that's happening more where specific business owners in the diaspora are outsourcing the servicing of their products, or perhaps the production of it, to their country of origin, thus benefiting themselves and their businesses and the country of origin. And you see the example here of El Salvador, but there are plenty of others where that is there. And then finally, in this, and I know the list could go on and on and on, but knowledge transfer. So, you know, this is actually one of the key areas, and there's been quite a lot of work done on this, going back to brain drain discussions and studies previously. But one of the things that's become more apparent, and I've seen specific businesses set up to do this, is actually because of COVID and the difficulty of travel, there was much more networking undertaken between diasporans and their country of origin using Zoom and other similar services. And I think generally the transfer of knowledge, and it can be technical, can be health driven, can be lots of different areas, but also just things around mentoring, financial management, all of those areas, is a fantastically strong tool, because it's being delivered by people who not only understand and are experts in their topic, but they have phenomenal links with their countries of origin. They speak the same language, they have the same culture, they know what's important. And this is an area where there are initiatives that are taking place. So I'm just going to try and summarize what's a lot of words in a long period of time for you all, I assume. But I've tried to cover a lot, maybe too much, but hopefully it's been useful. Remittances and diaspora investment are both a positive side of migration. And I think there's often so much negativity about migration, these get forgotten, but they're both positive sides. Between them, the two areas probably account for over $1 trillion worth of value going to developing countries, which is a pretty phenomenal figure. But the majority is actually private flows of funds. But as diaspora investment grows, there's an opportunity for government to become involved and to harness a lot more. But they can only really do that if they do their homework properly, understand what solutions are right for them, and importantly for their diasporas. And in this area, a lot more work is needed. So it's a dynamic space. It's changing far too rapidly for somebody like me to keep up with. So hopefully all of you can sort of take the baton from here. And with that, Gregory, I'll try and get a glass of water and come back for Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you very much for this extensive presentation with a lot of details and a lot of information. On personal level, I was more focused on remittances, but you have added so much information that I didn't know. So I'm really happy to have heard about your presentation, about your experience. The people in the chat are very shy. There is just one question that I've already received, which is from Patty, and she says, "Hi, Leon, great presentation. Do you think with with diverse diaspora and various homelands engagement practices at micro levels and across countries that the distinction between remittances and diaspora investment is becoming blurry or narrow?" I don't know if you can already answer this question.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Paddy. Thanks for that question. Actually, it's a really good question. I suspect you know the answer to this better than me. I think at the moment it is blurry, and actually I had written down to make a comment about that as well, because often when we're looking at this from development angles, there's quite a big confusion between remittances, say, and diaspora investment. And often what we see is that when people are really meaning diaspora investment, they're actually talking about remittances. There's this sort of thought process that if I send 100 euros to you as a remittance, that actually we could just take that 100 euros and you could invest it in some sort of, let's say, more productive use. You could buy a motorbike or something, or you could set up a shop, whatever it is, and that actually that is the same transaction. Whereas there are two different things. One, a remittance is a transfer of money. That's the beginning and the end. It's a transfer of money. What the receiver does with it is almost after the money has been sent and received. So it's outside of being a remittance. It is then a decision for them. Do I spend it on consumption, or do I invest it, put it into a savings account, put it into a business, or so on? Whereas a diaspora investment is a specific decision taken probably jointly by the sender and receiver, so the diaspora member or the migrant with their family at home, on what they're going to do with the money. And then they would send money specifically for to put in a particular investment initiative. I think it's blurred for many reasons, partially because there's not enough good understanding and definition, but also partially because it costs so much to send the money that people often amalgamate they just collect one amount, because the way some companies have charged is the more you send, the lower the cost from a percentage viewpoint. And so people understand this, they send a lot more money, but then part of it gets divided for investment and part as pure for consumption. But it's very difficult because it's not split out by people. So I fear that my answer has become blurry as well. But actually, I think you're right. It is blurred, and we need much greater clarity in this. And we should say, if somebody's sending a remittance, they're using it for consumption. If somebody wants to send it for investment, let's look at it as an investment and treat it as an investment with all the caveats and protections that a normal investor would have. So that's my starting answer, but I think couldn't see you there. So you're going to come back at me.
Well, just to engage in the discussion, because it's something I've been thinking about, but also something that other people have asked. You know, when we make this, the distinction is for the reasons you've just broken down, that it's quite difficult, and also because investment in form of the global south, and I don't like that terminology, but you know, for the homelands, and a lot of times it's informal. So you've got such a huge informal sector that I could be running a shop with my sister, and we lump everything together with the cost for my mother's healthcare, children's school fees, and so on. And that could also include future expenses that are coming for food and health, and say, why don't you use this money for the business? And then at the end of the month, you pay the school fees. So there's such micro level of information and detail in there. But I thought I could just, you know, get that response from, and maybe just a comeback question then, in terms of this disaggregation at the end user. And have you found some interesting pieces of research that we could kind of also look at and explore, particularly in the classroom setting, where we try to understand the use of remittances sort of beyond, you know, this level of disaggregation? Have there been some that come in? And then the very last question is sort of on this know your customer requirements, and how that links to irregular migration. And, you know, we know that money is the same color, regardless of the legal status and how it's obtained. But a lot of migrants would have been away from home and in an irregular situation. So the fact that, you know, central banks and so on want to have a lot of information about where the money is coming from, you may have that gray area because you have irregular migrants who may not be upfront and willing to give a lot of information about themselves because of the status of where they are and how they make their livelihoods, and the issue of trust that you built. So I thought if you could rope that in those two questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. No, I think that's really good. I think the disaggregation question, there has not been enough work on that. I think it's fair to say. What there has been seems to have been driven by a few money transfer companies that have conducted research and then selectively taken pieces for their own PR, but nonetheless, it's there. I'm thinking companies like World Remit and so on, who are able to itemize, because when you use those services, you have to put the reason for transfer. They've taken that data and then disaggregated it. I think the challenge is, and it comes back to this piece that, as you said, people send one lump sum and then it gets divided for different uses. In fact, in many cases, it gets divided between different families because people would rather send one large amount and then a broker effectively collects it at the receiving end and divides it for all the families. But of course, from the international record keeping, that's one transaction, which will probably get lumped as a remittance if we're lucky. I think so that there's a long way of saying there's not that much information, but I would say I think this is also where digitization helps a bit, because one of the things we've seen is that with mobile money, the average transaction size sent cross-border, and as you know, it's particularly strong in Africa. I think 46% of all mobile money transactions take place in Africa, is that the average is about $80, whereas with the traditional cash-based remittances, it's more like 200. But what you're starting to see is, as the cost of actually making a transaction comes down, people are sending more and more transactions of lower value. And so as we go forward, I hope that we'll see better disaggregation. And certainly this is where I think particularly the mobile subsection of digitization will make a real difference. So I'll keep a lookout for other sources because I'm as fascinated as you, but it's not easy to come by. We do need generally much more research on remittances from the demand side, on the user. Most of the research that's been done is around product types, costs and so on, or suppliers, but there's not enough that's understood about users, not only their habits, but also what their needs and their desires are, what will change their information. On the KYC side, yeah, that's a really good point. Just to sort of say, I think some of it depends on where you are as to what you can do. So, you know, in Europe now, it's pretty much impossible to be able to make a formal transfer without some form of formal identification. And some countries have gone further and said, not only does the money, do you have to have your ID verified, but you also have to have your migration status verified as well. Italy is a good example of a country that has basically made it illegal for licensed money transfer operators to be able to transfer money for somebody who doesn't have the appropriate authorization to be in the country. And we see that as a growing trend. I think, as you probably know, in South Africa, which is obviously the big draw and send market for Southern Africa, the government has tried, the Reserve Bank has tried to be a bit more flexible and introduce light touch KYC information. So they basically brought in risk-based approaches, where the individual companies that are licensed basically agree with the central bank that up to a certain amount, it's normally low level, both in a transaction size and total amount sent each month. You don't necessarily need to see a formal ID. You need to be able to identify the person, but there are different ways of doing that as well, and maybe secondary supporting data and so on, but only up to a certain amount. And once you get over that, it's quite different. So it's a big challenge, and I think it's not going away anytime soon, unfortunately. And it means that the irregular migrants in many countries have very little or no option to actually use a formal channel, which is a big problem.
Okay, we have another comment from Iman. He says, it is interesting how the one lump sum is partially invested in creating microfinance in addition to other uses, and on the sending side, families have also created small funds to pool money they sent home. But I see she raised her hand. Maybe she can elaborate on that more specifically.
Thank you. Thanks for the very interesting presentation today. I find it literally lighting bulbs in my mind because I do have chats with my fellow expats or diaspora members, expats when we are outside the second home, yet still involved in sending money to the country of origin. That's a 3-country cycle for the money. Because sometimes I'm in a third country, but I'm using my bank account in my second home country, which is Canada, to send money to Sudan or to somebody in another part of Africa.
Wow.
But what I find more interesting is, I mean, the way I'm able to see it now is that as if each and every member of the diaspora is a moving bank in and by themselves. Every one of us is a banking system. And how burdensome is that? I was recently talking to a friend who's a Sudanese settled in the US. And then the social aspects also get woven into this. This is the big brother of a family of many siblings. So they have a social position and a responsibility towards the country back home, towards the very extended family back home. So by default, this is the person responsible for running the support from that multi-sibling family to a very extended family structure. And it just felt burdensome that this person had to plan how much his siblings are pooling or putting together in order for funds to reach back home. Another element is the rising and falling amount of money being sent in line with crises, in line with health issues, with surgical operations that crop up. And then the same person having to also adjust the amount that goes into the pool from each sibling, again in line with the employment status of each of the siblings, some in the US, some in other countries in Europe, some in Canada, and so on. And without noticing, that person is shouldering a huge burden, apparently. So I just thought how many members of the diaspora are doing the same? And is there no better way to do it? Thank you.
Well, Iman, that's a great comment and insight, really. I think worthy of a whole set of study as well. And I, imagine for somewhere like Sudan, which is particularly difficult to send money to through formal channels, not just with obviously the current severe situation, but for many, many years because of controls and so on. I suspect there are many, many families like how you've just described, because there's a lot, as you said, of extended families. And part of the challenge is that everything gets grossed up or multiplied up because it is so difficult to make a physical transfer. If it was a lot easier, like using your WhatsApp and you can just get a message over and that's your contribution going to the right person, then maybe in the future we can use technology to tackle that. But at the moment, it is so difficult to send money formally to somewhere like Sudan or many other places that you need to send a large amount and then subdivide it. But actually it must be so stressful. And as you say, I think the whole piece about, even if it was a predictable flow, it'd still be stressful. But then you put in the challenges within the family, whether, as you say, it's health or, livelihood, droughts and those things. It's very difficult. You would like to say there are solutions there. I think technology would help a bit, but actually obviously improving the livelihoods and the environments in the receiving countries is the ultimate solution. But as we're a long way from there, I think we can start looking incrementally and then hope for some much bigger solutions. But unfortunately, in a country like Sudan, the choices of how to send money is also another problem. And if the funds are not available where you want because actually coverage is poor, that becomes another challenge. So it is stressful and there are better solutions, but in order to achieve that, you also need to have the right political environment and operational environment to make that happen. So thanks a lot for that, and love to learn more. Actually, it sounds like a terrible thing to be living through, but something that hopefully we could look at. And actually, just as an aside, talking to a couple of governments who've got a strong interest in improving the systems for sending money to Sudan. Maybe this is the more information we have like yours, hopefully the better the brains we can put on it to maybe try and find solutions in the medium term anyway. Back to you, Gregory.
Okay, thank you very much. There is another comment, and after that comment, I would also like to encourage like 2 persons maybe for a question, and then we will have to end the lecture. So the comment says it's from FCO. What other economic or legal mechanism could we promote to integrate irregular migrants into societies?
Well, that's like that's another whole lecture, I think, from your side. Not really my area of expertise, I'd say, except that I think, you know, I would turn it around maybe to the topic I'm talking about is really to say is how can we enable irregular migrants to be able to use formal financial services, which I think is so. I'm sorry that I can't answer the broader question you've got, but I think some of it comes back to what I was discussing with Paddy, which is sort of to say that obviously there needs to be a distinction, and you know, international organizations, FATF, which is the global anti-money laundering body, produces guidance to each country or to all countries, which basically starts off with what they call the risk-based approach. So it's saying you need to look at, as a money transfer company, what is the inherent risk in the transaction that I'm undertaking? And if the person is sending $10 as opposed to $1,000 or $10,000, the risk of them that being illegal money or money laundering of some sort or another, or a danger to the financial system is quite different depending on the amount. And so their guidance is that there should be this risk-based approach. Unfortunately, many countries have actually adopted and said, well, we're taking a risk-based approach, but it applies to every single transaction. So they basically just completely ignored the guidance. And I think much more work needs to be done to help governments and regulators understand the different risk levels within the different sizes of transactions or the different types of transactions, so that we could have a much more risk-based approach to remittance transactions. So for me, I'm not sure I can say much more now. Happy to go into it offline as well. I think it's an excellent point. And unfortunately, the way the regulations currently work, it actually forces people to use precisely the services that governments don't want them to do, because they're not legally allowed to use the formal ones.
Thank you very much. We have 2 last comments. One is from Andrew. Among the challenges of the diaspora, you mentioned in your presentation lack of trust in the government. What mechanism can governments employ to remedy this?
That is a great question. And I think, it's not easy to answer. I think some of the mechanisms they need to do and undertake, it's really a long-term process. It's not like one day they wake up and say, hey, these people don't really trust us. We'll just institute something that lets them do it. I think it's things about having, I mean, there's certain factual things and different countries have different issues. It may be around whether they have dual citizenship or not. It may be around whether the diaspora is able to participate in the politics of their country of origin and so on. But a lot of it starts off with being open with the diaspora, with communicating to them, with going out and listening. I think particularly listening, not so much talking, but listening to the diasporans and what they want to do, and doing this on a continual basis, helping develop formal diaspora organizations and community feedback areas. Some countries have done this very well, and others just haven't started. But it's part of a long-term process. And actually, I think I'd encourage people to read that. I gave the example of the African Development Bank Diaspora Investment template. Within that, there's a section on some of the things they can do. So happy to share that, Gregory, and then maybe we can circulate that for people, and also to talk further, because I think, Andrew, it's exactly the right question. And what I'd really say is it's long term is my main thing. You've got to do it over a long period of time, and it's a lot of two-way communication. So do we have one more?
Yes, we have. We have one large question, but I don't know if you can answer it. It's from Pushpa. Some irony in global diaspora funds being used in some countries to fuel various forms of nationalism, such as religious. This could happen with formal and informal transfers. I don't know if you can answer or comment on that, but after that we will close the lecture.
Yeah, I'm not sure I want to comment on that, but actually I think it's a really good point, Pushpa. I'm not so sure. I think your second sentence in that about could be formal or informal is exactly right. I suppose how I would tend to look at it is, if you're looking at it from a remittances angle, then the funds moving from A to B and is the most important part, and then how people use that to get into the financial system. But of course, at the end of the day, anybody transferring funds to another person could be for a whole series of reasons. I think it is ironic, but unfortunately, it's a bit like, I suppose we've just been talking about the KYC controls, which are designed to stop money laundering, terrorism, and so on. There's not really that much, unless it's contravening a law or a local cultural practice. I don't know what else can be done legally anyway to stop an individual deciding how they choose to use their money. I think there is, in a way, if we can improve the market and bring more transparency, and again, that's where the digital solutions really come in, then there's the potential to understand more, but then that also comes with risks, particularly around personal privacy and so on. So it's a difficult one, but I think, from my viewpoint, it is ironic. Hang on, I'm just looking at the other questions, so I should ignore them coming through. But I think it is ironic. There are, I think, efforts have been made to try and control that, where it's for organisations that are spreading disharmony or are against the local laws. But generally speaking, very difficult area to control. And as you say, if you control it from a formal side, that won't stop the money flowing informally. Which I think is also, a pretty important area there. Okay,
the last of the last questions is just coming from Alnura. Do you know any examples of faith-based religious organizations being a good example of money transfer back home?
I wouldn't know the individual names, but I think you see plenty of good examples of, say, churches, in some of the big community churches I'm familiar with, say, in the UK or the US, many churches sending money, collecting groups of money and sending it back to Nigeria, for instance. We know, say, in New Zealand, actually, I gave the example of Tonga earlier. One of the good things is there, for instance, the Tongan community in New Zealand, they're religious, very religious groups within the churches. They've also been collecting funds, both community and individually, to be able to send them back. We know a lot of money that goes through the Arab communities or through Muslim charities and so on. Again, these are more, exactly as you said, faith-based organizations that are often collecting funds for specific projects that are then sent home back for the benefit of the whole community. And that is often for educational or health types of support. So there's a lot in there. And I think the key is for that is probably two things. One is the organization, so that the people who are donating know what they're donating for, and that also there's accountability for when the funds arrive back. But then the other part is that the funds just flow as quickly and cheaply and efficiently as possible. So hopefully that helps a little there.
Okay, thank you very much, Liam, for this presentation with the answers and extensive details. I think we've learned so much about your insights and experience. What I can say is, again, thank you for attending this meeting, for being available to us for this lecture. I want to thank also everyone for attending this lecture, not only today, because today is the last one, but for all the lectures that you have attended, and for trusting us, the organizers, in this process. And I would like to invite you for the next online program that we will organize. So I want to thank you again, and also to keep this energy and keeping this motivation in not only changing the world, but also changing your own field in whether it be migration or development. So thank you very much, and I can only say to the next time. So bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you very soon.